Good morning and good afternoon to all of you attending. Welcome to this first availability webinar for Trouw Nutrition Celco feed additives. Today we are going to talk about bioavailability and beyond. Before we get started, my name is Chantal van Lin. I'm going to be your host for today, and I have a few things that I want to address. One is that you can raise questions at any time during this presentation. We will have a Q&A session after the presentation, but if you have questions during, you can use your GoToWebinar panel to ask questions. You have an option there. You can type in your questions. I can see them come in, and we will address them in the Q&A session or during the presentation if necessary. This webinar will be recorded and will be available upon request afterwards. The same goes for handouts that will be available as well. A small disclaimer. Please note that all product names and claims mentioned in this webinar are generic and can differ from your local situation. So please contact your local sales, Celco or Trouw representative to discuss your needs and options. As I said, the first of a series that we are doing on abilities of IntelliBond. The first one is today, bioavailability, and we have a few more to come during the year. So it's going to be a series every 2 months. So you're more than happy to join the other series as well. So for today, bioavailability on the agenda, we have 2 speakers. The first one is Sjane Boekhorst. She's our regional ruminant manager in Asia Pacific, located in Bangkok. And we have David, who's going to present. David Brito. He's our global trace mineral program manager, located in the Netherlands, but coming from Brazil. So with no further ado, I'm just going to give the floor to David, who's going to take you through the agenda and the first part of the presentation.
Thank you, Chantal. Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon for some others. Thank you for joining our webinar today. So it's the first one of a series that we're just gonna be driving the discussion and also information, research on the IntelliBond abilities and beyond. Today, the focus is gonna be bioavailability, especially for ruminants. So our agenda today, we're gonna have some trace mineral overlook, talk a little bit about source. Of course, we go a little bit on the metal absorption. Then we're going to share some research on relative bioavailability of trace mineral source, and also some performance result when it comes to the use of trace minerals, especially IntelliBond, compared to sulfates. And then Sjane come to bring us a highlight for the nutritional recommendation, and also manganese, copper, and zinc consideration when it comes to the application in a customer level, in a more field recommendation for the use of the IntelliBond. And then you can wrap up with our summary, okay? So I hope everyone enjoying our presentation. Please don't hesitate to make any question along with the question box, but also after this presentation, we'll be very glad to be answered by email any doubts or any considerations you have for the presentation. So I'm going to start now. I hope now I can move correctly my slides. Yes. So minerals overlook. So why do we supplement trace minerals? So first thing, dietary concentrations aren't always high enough to meet the nutritional demand of them. So with the development and the advance of the genetics, especially for the dairy cows, but also for any other livestock species, we know we are not being able to really, the amount of trace mineral in the feed is not being enough to fulfill the demand or the requirements. Also, to ensure, we also supplement trace minerals to ensure the mineral availability, to make sure that to ensure the minerals are available to the animal during situations that really affect trace mineral availability. For example, in case of stress or any other challenge that the animal perhaps go through, such as parturition, disease. So, and this is a very well-known graph that comes to when you cross-link between function and concentration intake of nutrients. So we know as much as we start to provide a mineral, we try to always to reach the supplementation to provide the optimal level of trace mineral. But of course, we have different trace minerals. This curve can be much more sensitive to toxicity or to subdosage. So the idea when it comes to the supplementation is to keep optimal, but we know that we can go through marginal, which can bring to deficiency of the trace minerals, which result in death. And of course, if you go over a little bit, can also have some marginal toxicity and then bring to some very high toxicity, which can also bring to the animal death. So the goal for any nutritionist when it comes to the delivery of the trace mineral metals is to try to provide for that herd or for the group of animals an optimal level of the trace mineral supplementation. So if you ensure the minerals are available to the animals when they need them, we're gonna be much more close to fulfill the requirement and also to explore all these genetics and this performance that we expect from the high genetics that we are using nowadays. And why those trace minerals are important to cows or to mammals, or even for us, and especially for trace minerals, is because we need trace mineral for enzymes. If you remember, just briefly, enzymes are proteins that make things happen. So for most of the functions and for most of the reaction, most of the functionality of the physiology of the dairy cow and also metabolism, enzymes are required. And metals play an important role as part of those enzymes. So in this case, if you have a lack of supplementation, or if you don't have like some special trace minerals such as copper, zinc, manganese, iron, selenium, we're gonna really affect the enzyme functionality, which is gonna really affect the physiology and the metabolism of the animals, which not gonna be performed as much as we wanna, or not gonna be performed correctly in moments of challenge. So for that reason, most of the time, just like example, trace minerals is very well required to make to be part of the enzyme. So, and you know, copper, zinc, manganese are important parts of many of these metalloenzymes, enzymes that contain metal. Without them, the enzyme do not work. So just to show some of the important functions, of course, briefly, we know copper, zinc, manganese play important functions in the physiology of the dairy cow, related, like in the case of copper, bone and joint health, immunity, fertility. Also, copper is very important for the iron metabolism. Also, zinc, many important functions on fertility, but also protein production, vitamin A utilization, and manganese also for immunity, lipid and carbohydrate utilization. But we also know when it comes to the trace mineral, you have several antagonists that can really impact the absorption or the availability of those trace minerals to the animal. And that can come, in the case of copper, phytate, molybdenum, and sulfur play an important role. Of course, in the case of the zinc, phytate, also fiber, phosphorus, iron, and can also be playing as an important antagonist. In the case of the manganese, calcium, iron, phosphorus. Just to give a picture how they are important for many functions, but of course, considering other metals that are available in the diet or available to the animal, also can really impact the availability of these animals in the future to be used by the animal for perform any functionality in the organism. So more the effects of these antagonists, less metals available to the animals, more impaired are the vital functions and responses. So I just gonna put this timeline. For those who has been following IntelliBond presentation from the last 1 year, we've been using that very often. But the idea here is to show we've been, with the advance of the genetics for Holstein or for generally Jersey or all genetics for the high-performing dairy cows, we see like for the last 120 years, a lot of movement to always improve the quality of the trace mineral source. So at the beginning, when you observe that the amount of trace mineral available in the feed was not enough to fulfill the requirements of the dairy cow, we start to use oxide that was available. But you see a shift for higher quality comes from sulfate, and then during the 40s after the wars, and of course in the 70s more the usage of organic trace mineral, and then in the middle of the 90s we start to have the development of the IntelliBond. So what's happened during this, let's say, last 120 years, you are moving for a trace mineral source which offer less stability, less homogeneity, and less bioavailability, to those who offer more stability, more homogeneity, and more bioavailability. And if you consider of all trace mineral sources available, IntelliBond, the hydroxy trace minerals are the latest, most modern technology for trace mineral source, which can offer more stability, more bioavailability as well. So this is a trend line of the development to always be looking for a better quality and better source of trace mineral that can really fulfill the requirement of the animals. So where are the IntelliBond key advantages? Just to go briefly here to see where the differences apply, I want to show you compared to sulfate, organics, and hydroxys, which is IntelliBond. It's very simple difference. So sulfates are very soluble source of trace mineral. You know that very well. And there is a reason for that, because the copper is connected to a sulfate, is attached to a sulfate ligand by an ionic bond. An ionic bond compared to covalent are weak bonds. So for this reason, in contact of moisture or water, we have the completed solubilization or the complete dissociation of this metal. So for this reason, we know how reactive sulfate is in case of copper, zinc, and manganese. So in this case, they offer, even if they offer lower price and medium concentration, because of the weak bonds, we're going to experiencing less stability and also more reactivity. In the 70s, as I mentioned, organic trace mineral sources started to be developed, and the idea about that is to provide stronger bonds, which could bring more stability and also could bring less reactivity. And that was really fulfilled. The organic trace mineral source, and even us here in Celco, you have also our portfolio for organic trace mineral source with the Optimis. We understand the value of a high good source of trace mineral source. And of course, an organic trace mineral source offer much more stability and reactivity compared to the sulfate. And there is a reason for that, because they have the covalent bond. But to produce organic trace mineral source, the ligand, when we call organics, because it contains carbon, that can be a polysaccharide, can be a proteinate, can be an amino acid chelate, can be a peptide. And when you use a molecule such like that, which is big in size, first thing that's happened to organic trace mineral source, we reduce the concentration compared to the sulfates. In this case, most of the concentration of the organic trace mineral source range between 10–20%. Of course, the glycinate right now have a higher concentration. There is a reason for that. The molecule is also smaller and also have a sulfate attached. But generally, what you see for the good source of organic trace mineral source is a very low concentration. And of course, because you talk about a very valuable nutrient as amino acid, the price is high. So using organics by cost effectiveness in diets, we never were able to really move to a 100% of the replacement. And then the reason why and how the hydroxides and the IntelliBond was developed in the 90s, because you could offer a trace mineral source covalent bond, but not attached to organic source. In this case, attached to hydroxides and chlorides. So we have a stronger bond as the covalent, what you found also in the organic, which offer higher stability and less reactivity, but with a very high concentration, range from 44 to 56%, which turns to be much more cost effective because first, it's higher concentrate, and also there is no amino acids connect, which does not improve that much the price compared. So in other words, chloride and hydroxide is cheaper when you compare to valuable nutrients such as peptides and amino acids. In this case, become more cost effective way to drive us to do a complete replacement of the sulfate when it comes to dairy cattle diets. Just an example here, like how trace mineral source can affect bioavailability. I just showing you here two pictures comparing IntelliBond C and copper sulfate. After 30 minutes mixing water, we can see there is a very we start to have, because of the high solubility, high reactivity of copper sulfate, you have everything dissociating mix in the water, as you can see the change in colors. And of course, what's happening here, you have the release of the copper. And this is just to show how the ionic bonds are weak. And and because the ionic bonds is weak, there is a very fast dissociation of the metal when exposed to moisture, which release the free ions, and the free ions are very free to react with many things, even before you deliver to the animal. Just right here is to compare sources just in room temperature with regular moisture temperature. You can see how coupling problems relate to copper or zinc sulfate when you compare to IntelliBond. We all know that. You all know how copper and zinc sulfate are reacted. Just to give an example by a picture here. A picture can say better than words sometimes. And we all recognize the positive and the negative effect of soluble trace mineral source. And you know that's very well applied. So copper sulfate is being used as an antimicrobial agent in many places, including hospital, to kill these super bacteria that you've been talking about. But in a daily basis for dairy production system, everybody that is being a dairy farm recognize that very well. There is a reason why you use copper or zinc sulfate to treat foot dermatitis or interdigital dermatitis in the farms. And the reason is because free copper and free zinc can kill these bugs. And you want that free to kill, and that's the reason we use. We know range from 2 to 5% of concentration solution. You know the effect of that. Of course, nowadays some areas will not be able to go to such type of products because the concentration of the copper zinc in the environment is being increasing. But the truth is, we know the value to be using a free and a very soluble source of copper or zinc. So, for that reason, we have the effect of the antimicrobial here because they are free. But do we want those free metals along to the diet or in the rumen, or even before that's available to absorption in the sites in the intestine of the animal? I don't think so. And that's the idea that I want to show here, because as soon as we have these free metals available, we're going to have copper and zinc or manganese reacting with other antagonists. So you're going to reduce the availability at the end of the GI tracts. In this case, every reaction that starts before can really jeopardize the absorption of the copper and zinc. So if the animal in the future needs the copper and zinc, you don't have that available. And that is about bioavailability that we're going to talk about today. So I'm just going to use as example a logic behind the trace mineral source stability absorption. I'm going to use zinc as example. So let's think about this zinc sulfate. Just because of moisture, you start to have clumping and also free zinc. So all that zinc available in your trace mineral source is already free to react. As soon as you mix that in a premix, first thing, you're going to have clumping problems in your premix. But of course, this free zinc can be already being reacting with other minerals, and I just showed some of the antagonists that play around zinc, but also can be reacting with some macro mineral sources, and also some vitamins, in special fat-soluble vitamins. In this case, you're going to have less available zinc in the future for the cow. With that, after you use this premix to be mixed in a feed, you still have free zinc. And this zinc is going to be reacting more with moisture and heat. So now you're going to have interaction with fat and oils. We're going to use in this case, all these reactions are going to also even reduce the availability of vitamins included, because you're going to have vitamins such as vitamin E or A going to be used as antioxidant to protect this oxidation of the fat. And also you're going to have the interaction with other feed stuff. In this case, interaction already with phytate available in some of the grain in the feed, but also other minerals. So you still have less available zinc in the future to the cow. So then the cow eats the feed. So in this, you have saliva with enzymes, you have pH changes right now. We have feed stuff, and also you have the inclusion of forage, and also you have free zinc. We're going to talk later on in other presentation during the seminar about the palatability issues related to the use of zinc and how IntelliBond can really support and improve the palatability. But right here, you're also going to have a less available zinc to the cow, and also the zinc can also affect the intake and also preferential choice of the animals. And then later on, when it comes to the rumen, you still have more free zinc. Now you have a lower pH, phytate, digesta, so less available zinc. And then changes in pH, also with more zinc, more hydrogen available right now in the in the rumen, also the digestive, the microbiota, the killing of bacteria. So all these are making your zinc be less and less available. So when you reach the intestine, you have less zinc available to be absorbed. And also what's going to be the result of this? You're going to have less zinc to be used for the vital functions, production, growth, pregnancy, and colostrum health. And also, of course, we're going to have more zinc waste in the environment. So you have some issues related to more phosphorus, but also zinc and copper if that was a copper source. Just to give an example, bioavailability and amount of the efficiency how a zinc source will be absorbed, you are already impacting since the beginning, since the type of source, since how stable is your source, can really impact the amount of zinc or the amount of metal they're going to be delivered to the animal to use for vital functions. So just to show example here, I'm just going to put like a copper absorption site. It's just to highlight here that we know there are specific channels, like in the case of copper, you know, there's the CTR1, which is the primary cellular protein involved in the absorption of copper. And also in the zinc, you know about the zip type the zip type channels, and also in special the zip4, which is considered the main intestinal zip transporter. So I just want to mention here, in the case of the absorption, we need the free metals, and we need the metal to be free in the site of absorption. So I know we've been talking in the industry, see a lot of information related to special channels for amino acids, except by the selenium. Most of the zinc, copper, manganese must to be free or release of the molecule to be absorbed. So if you have a stable molecule that can go since the production of the premix, the feed production, go to the entire GI tract, and when reach the abomasum, can release this metal, we're gonna reduce the chance to have that metal really react with other sources of antagonists. In this world, any molecule can be a sulfate, a oxide, or even an organic source, amino acid chelate, a proteinate, or a glycinate. All these molecules must to release the metals to be absorbed. And so, and they have, and how stable they can be to release this metal much more close to the site absorption, going to improve the availability of this metal, or they want to improve the efficiency of absorption of this metal. So, and highlight has free or ionic form to be absorbed. We must have like free or ionic form of metal. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about bioavailability, and then I'm going to give the words to my colleague Shanna to go through the application of the trace mineral bioavailability. So trace mineral bioavailability, just to mention, is the efficiency in which an element or a metal is absorbed and reach the systemic circulation in order to be distributed to organs and tissues and used for physiological functions. And you can really measure bioavailability in vivo, and there's two important ways to do this. One, we can feed the metal or the mineral above the requirements and measure the accumulation tissues. There is an advantage for that. You can use practical diets. You can do a short studies, but also there is an advantage because estimates may not agree with those obtained using diets deficient in the mineral. And of course, there is the second way, which the feed the mineral below requirements and measure a specific response. There is an advantage. So you measure the mineral utilizations, and also you mimic a practical situation reflecting the goal. But also there is a disadvantage because it's difficult to formulate diets deficient in some trace mineral, especially for ruminants, because of the amount of availability of trace mineral when it comes from forage. So in this case, these two types of relative in vivo trial can be done and can be realized. So right here, I'm going to show some of the studies that have been done when it comes to bioavailability per se, and also for response for the trace minerals when you are working with higher dose. So in other words, you're going to see the two scenarios here, and how you understand a stable trace mineral source such as a hydroxide IntelliBond can be very helpful and can be a very important source of trace mineral when it comes to dairy cattle diets. So of course, measure bioavailability in vivo bioavailability is fast relative to a standard source. You always compare to something else. And this design of the study is very important. So things to understand what is the trace mineral status, what the physiological state, what are their mineral needs. All these are very important questions to make. The ideal scenario is to have 3 concentrations of both standard test mineral with a range of concentration that will give a linear response in the availability criteria measured. The ratio between the slope of the dosage response curves you use to estimate bioavailability of test source relative to standard source. It's difficult to include in cattle because of the cost involved with multiple treatment levels. So you know all things that play along when it comes to the availability test. So, and of course, when it comes to a bioavailability, in this case, you want to also realize which are the best markers, because not, I mean, you provide two different sources and you see a difference in milk production. That do not mean one source is more bioavailable than the other. And that's the reason you must go also for the correct biomarkers to make sure you are really evaluating correctly what is the advantage between sources. In the case of copper for ruminants, the concentration of copper in liver is very important and can be a very important biomarker to us. Also, total zinc retention in the case of ruminants, in the case of zinc. In the manganese, you can also talk about some heart manganese superoxide dismutase, which can be a special case, but of course in monographs you can talk about the concentration of the manganese in bone. Remember, the manganese compared to copper and zinc, the storage is not that high. So most of the manganese, the absorption manganese is very, very low compared to the others trace minerals such as copper and zinc. And they use the animal use instantaneously by the body. So in this case, it's not always simple to do a manganese bioavailability trial compared when you do with copper and zinc. So showing here a very nice trial done, published in 2004 in the Animal Feed Science Technology Journal, done by the group of Dr. Jerry Spears at North Carolina State University. We are the trial here. We are using 60 steers, 10 steers per treatment, using different doses of copper from 0, 5, and 10 ppm, and use molybdenum and sulfur to work as antagonists. In this case, you are causing a deficiency of absorption of copper. And the idea here is to see which source would be much more bioavailable. So we did an initial liver biopsy in the pre-trial, and after 98 days, we did a second liver biopsy to see the concentration of copper in the animal, in the liver. So in this case, of course, any other measurements were taken, but when it comes to liver copper, we could compare sulfate versus IntelliBond, a difference in bioavailability. So almost twice more available IntelliBond C compared to copper sulfate. In other words, in this type of trials, when you're causing this deficiency of the copper absorption, that's the result you can expect from the IntelliBond. Later on, in 2017, another bioavailability trial was done with zinc, in this case, comparing the zinc hydroxychloride, the IntelliBond Z versus zinc sulfate in growing cattle, also done by North Carolina State University. For those who knows, Dr. Jerry Spear and his group in special North Carolina State University, they develop a very high knowledge to develop this type of trials where they have the facility appropriate to do. So some of the companies that work with trace mineral source have really developed trials over there to understand the availability or to understand the relative bioavailability of the trace mineral source compared to sulfates or other trace mineral source. In this case, to the case of the zinc, a different type of trial, they will cause a 4-day depletion period with the zinc, and then the dietary zinc treatment start on the day 15 as a repletion phase for 4 days, and then you have the acclimation, and then the total fecal and urine collection for 5 days. In this case, you also see, in this case, when you come to the total retained zinc, which is let's say the best information or the best biomarker you can have for bioavailability of zinc, you are talking about also twice, about 204% compared to the zinc sulfate. So this is, and why you expect this, and the reason is very simple. During this trial also, and there's a lot of information available to share when it comes to the stability of the IntelliBond. So more stable source, they are much more able to deliver the metal to the site of absorption. In this case, reduce the chance of antagonism to lose free copper or free zinc along the GI tract or during the feed production. In this case, if the animal needs zinc, in that case, you cause the need of zinc and you cause the need of copper because they are really in depletion. So in this case, the metals are there, they can really be able to absorb the metal, because who's gonna choose how much metal is needed to absorption is not the source, is the animal. So you must have the metal over there free to absorption. So, and that's why we see this very nice response when it comes to the more stable trace mineral source such as IntelliBond. Okay. So what about other trace mineral source? I'm just going to highlight here using the same methodology, of course, other trace minerals. In this case, I am showing here the glycinates. Okay. In the case of the glycinates, we could see some advantages, of course, compared to the sulfate as well. So the best result for glycinate when it comes to liver copper, of course, they use two, in this trial, different than our trial, they use two different concentrations of molybdenum in the diet. But for the best result, you saw about 150% for the copper glycinate and about 127 for the zinc glycinate. Just to give an example, their organic trace mineral source also play an important role to be more stable and also to offer a higher bioavailability. But of course, in the case of these trials, the hydroxide shows a better advantage when compared to regular glycinates. So, and now I'm going to show some of the performance results you see, and I'm going to be a timeline here. This was a trial published in the Journal of the Dairy Science done with Cornell University, published in 2014, which is a transition period trial. So 60 multiple cows were supplemented from day -28 to 84, and they were housed in Thai style. Treatment were tropidest once daily, and they received one of 3 treatments. The supplemental trace mineral source were 15, 60, 40 milligrams per kilogram of dry matter for copper, zinc, and manganese. They were receiving completely sulfate, copper, zinc, and manganese, a combination of sulfate and organic. In this trace, you use amino acid chelate, and also they received the IntelliBond completely in the diet to fulfill these supplemental trace mineral inclusion rates. In this case, what we could see is, of course, that was a transition period study. You want to see how the animals experience this transition. So in terms of oxidative stress, as you can see in green, the animals receiving IntelliBond really experience a better oxidative stress. So they are much, in other words, for all this oxidative stress caused during parturition, animals that receive IntelliBond shows lower free barbiturics or other antioxidant or another antioxidant markers compared to the other treatments. In other words, they are experiencing better all this oxidative stress during the period. And also, when it comes to some inflammatory markers, also IntelliBond shows up a lower haptoglobin in the first week postpartum. You know how haptoglobin is an important food phase protein. We know most of the animals do not show any level for haptoglobin until they are really experiencing some challenge or stress. In this case, to have a lower haptoglobin level shows that they are really modulating or really experiencing the inflammation in a better way, or they are healthier. In other words, that's the case we see here with the IntelliBond when compared to sulfate and the combination. So if you have a healthier cow during transition, what you can expect? Of course, you can expect a higher intake and also higher production, and that was the case. We just saw here compared to the sulfate, the improvement of milk in the peak of lactation about 4.3. In other words, here we can really summarize that IntelliBond reduce oxidative stress and inflammation during transition and help cows reach peak milk quicker. Another trial done now by Alexandre Souza back in UC Davis in 2016 was a multiple cows randomly assigned to dietary treatment, which was fed for 10 weeks. In this case, both treatments was receiving copper from IntelliBond, but the idea here is to make the replacement of the zinc combination with sulfate and organic, and the manganese sulfate by IntelliBond Z and IntelliBond N. So, and this cow or donors, they receive after partum for 10 weeks one of these 2 treatments, and embryos in that case were collected about 65 days postpartum. We know that for donors cows, that's not what we use. Generally, we collect these embryos in a later stage, but after 100 days in milk. But in this case, you just want to try to repeat how would be the collection of this embryo in a cow just after finish the voluntary waiting period, or when they are ready to get to inseminate or get to reproduction. So as a result of this trial done in California, was a very interesting trial. We see when the supplementation of the complete IntelliBond package really reduced the proportion of degenerated embryos compared to all structures, and also the degenerated embryos compared to all fertilizing structure. In other words, you have higher improvement of the number of the proportion of cows that have a higher good quality feasible embryos. And that was in a very big farm, very big, well known in California, which use a lot embryo selling for part of the business. So after that, we understand that they replace everything for IntelliBond because of some of these results that we will present to them. So IntelliBond improved embryo quality in this trial. This is another nice trial, which just was published last year in the Journal of the Dairy Science. That was done here in our dairy research facility in Netherlands. So here, just a picture of the facility. That was a partnership not just between the Tron Nutrition in Netherlands, but also with our colleagues in micronutrients, the Tron Nutrition, also part of the Nutreco company in the US. So 62 Holstein Friesian cows, multipros and primipros. They were designed in a 4x4 Latin square in 4 periods of 21 days. They receiving 4 treatments: completely sulfate, IntelliBond, a combination of sulfate for organic trace mineral, and a combination of IntelliBond with organic trace mineral. So in this result, I'm going to show some of the contrast and effects here. So we use, in this case, we're using the construct compare hydroxides versus sulfates. So IntelliBond, the source, improved milk yield in multipro in primipros cow by 1.1 kilogram of milk per day, but also improve the fat content in milk for multipros cow about 51 grams per day. And I just want to highlight here that also feel a huge benefit on the NDF digestibility. In our next webinar, you are all invited to learn more about how IntelliBond can really affect the digestibility of diets for dairy cows, and see all the benefits to be using IntelliBond diets. Right here, just to highlight that you also saw that benefit. And that was really the reason we're looking for the trial as well. So IntelliBond also could improve milk for the dairy cows in here compared to the sulfates. And right here also just recently published in the Journal of the Dairy Science, another trial done right now just for IntelliBond zinc compared to zinc sulfate on the biomarkers of inflammation, intestinal integrity during feed restriction. So this was done in partnership with the Iowa State University, 24 Holstein cows in a 2x2 factorial receiving ad libitum of feed restricted. You know, using feed restricted can really be a good design to cause leaky gut in the case of the dairy cows. And also using or not using 1 or 2 sources of sulfates of zinc, one from zinc sulfate or IntelliBond zinc at 25 ppm. So first thing that we could see, as you can see by this picture, you have really improvement of the integrity of the villi or in of the cells in the intestine. So we know feed restriction really alter mucus production, can really reduce gut surface area, can improve the circulation of bacterial components in the area, and also can cause a systemic inflammation. As you can see, when it comes to sulfate, more systemic local inflammation, as you can see for the dark purple dots right here, but also the size and the area surface of the villi is completely changed, just to show that we were able to observe this difference when it comes to the use of a better or more bioavailable source of zinc that really play along in the intestinal integrity, not just systemic, but in the cell, in the absorption site. But of course, also we could see other more systemic result. For example, as I mentioned before, the importance of haptoglobin. When you compare, you see when you compare ad libitum versus feed restriction, of course, ad libitum animals really improve compared to feed restriction. The amount of haptoglobin was increased, but it is very nice to compare 2 treatments here where you can compare the feed restriction treatments between IntelliBond and sulfate. So animals that were under feed restriction that received IntelliBond zinc really reduced the amount of haptoglobin, showing again also how they could really experience and also how it could really react to inflammation in a better way. And of course, when it comes here to another marker, which is the mieloperoxidase, which you know is an important marker for for some of antimicrobial activity of neutrophils. When it comes to the use of IntelliBond, we also when it comes to the use of feed restriction, we know feed restriction can really reduce the concentration of the myeloperoxidase, showing that feed restriction really impacts the antimicrobial activity of neutrophils. But when you choose for a different source, compare sulfate versus IntelliBond, you're also going to see improvement of this myeloperoxidase enzyme. So myeloperoxidase proteins. In this case, IntelliBond zinc being more available, a better source, can also improve this, let's say, antimicrobial activity of the neutrophil, or this power of adhesion of the neutrophil can offer, which is very important to fight bacteria and other microbial agents. So now I'm gonna give the chance to my colleague Shanna, comes with some nutritional consideration. This was just like a summarization on the importance of the stability source of trace minerals, especially IntelliBond, and how IntelliBond goes to bioavailable research, and also some of other trials that have been published more recently.
Great. Thank you so much, David. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon. So yeah, as David already said, I would like to give a little bit of a different spin on the story that we just heard. So I think, as a short recap of what we just heard, we know that trace mineral source or choice for trace mineral source is important. We know that if you choose for a more stable trace mineral source, you will see less antagonism occurring, which is especially relevant in the ruminant, because obviously we have a big rumen where these reactions can occur a lot. And in the case of IntelliBond, we've got data to show that it's better bioavailable compared to sulfates, and we see that that influences obviously performance. So my question is a little bit, okay, how do we implement that in a practical ration? So if we go to the next slide, I've been told to be a little bit patient with switching of the slides. Yes, so I just want to link it a little bit to the NRC requirements. Obviously, there are different nutritional systems, but I'm just referring to NRC as I think one of the most used nutritional requirement, in this case for dairy cattle. So I'm referring to the 2001 edition. So basically, if you look to NRC, how they require or how they determine what the mineral requirement is of an animal, they take a factorial approach and they look at a couple different factors. So the first one is maintenance. So any animal will always require nutrients, including trace mineral, to maintain themselves. The second one is growth, because obviously if you are growing, you're basically forming new tissue, so you need a certain amount of trace minerals for that. Then in the case of a gestating or pregnant animal, you would also need some trace minerals for gestation, because the fetus is growing, you've got fetal membranes, you've got your uterine tissue, so that's all growing. And of course, in the case we're talking about a lactating dairy cow, she also needs some trace minerals for lactation, and that's basically equal to trace minerals that are secreted in milk. So this is a specific example for zinc, but it will be the same for other trace minerals. So in this specific example of this specific cow, based on NRC requirements, we know that the cow would need 237 milligrams of absorbed zinc. And that's very important to know, because we're talking about absorbed zinc. That also brings us directly to I think one of the weakest links if we're talking about nutrition or trace mineral requirements, because how do we translate this 237 milligrams of absorbed zinc that she needs every day to how much should we feed? Because obviously if we feed, let's say we feed 100 milligrams, only a certain percentage is absorbed. So NRC sets absorption coefficients, which is basically the percentage of the trace mineral that they think will be absorbed in the gut. And for zinc, they've set that at 15%. And I'm just going to show you where that 15% is coming from, because I think that also shows you a little bit where some of the difficulties are. So We see, if you go to the chapter, the NRC chapter on zinc, you see that there are different sources mentioned. Most of them are pretty old. But the most important thing that I just want to stress here is that the amount of zinc that you see here that is absorbed is hugely varying from study to study. So there is a number as an absorption coefficient that we work with, but in real life, this absorption coefficient will always be different. And to explain that a little bit better, I just want to show you very schematic way of how trace minerals are absorbed. So this is a picture of the gut. And as we said, we're talking about absorbed trace minerals. So they basically have to be absorbed into the bloodstream. And we're talking about trace minerals coming from the diet. So as David already explained earlier, if we're talking about trace minerals in the diet, part of that will be available and part of that won't be available. And that basically has to do with the solubility of the trace mineral. So in case the trace mineral is not available, it can be that it's, for example, too tightly bound to the ligand. So for example, copper oxide is very unavailable. So it might be that it's too tightly bound to the ligand, so it cannot be absorbed. Or it can also be that is bound to an antagonist, which is obviously very important. We've talked about it quite a lot. So for example, in this case, we will talk about that later a little bit as well, copper that forms a complex with molybdenum and sulfur, which means that it's unavailable. But part of the trace mineral will be available. However, part of the trace mineral that will be available, not everything will be absorbed, because absorption is regulated by different mechanisms. Very important way is active transport through transporters, and based on the animal mineral status, the animal will up or down regulate the absorption. And moreover, also, even if trace minerals are absorbed, they can later be again secreted back into the gut lumen, for example, through the bile of the animal. And in the end, everything that's secreted, that is not absorbed, will end up in the feces. So you can already imagine, and that's the reason why I showed this, is that there are many factors that influence it. There are dietary factors, but there are also animal factors that influence how much trace mineral will be absorbed. And this is just an overview of some of those factors. So can have an influence. So it can be obviously species, genetics, age, sex, physiological state, which is partly captured in, let's say, how NRC calculates the trace mineral requirement, like maintenance, growth, but also what we just stressed, nutritional status, because you just saw trace mineral absorption can be up and down regulated, which means that, for example, if you feed excessively high trace minerals for a period of time, the absorption will be reduced. And also an influence, for example, from intestinal or rumen microflora. And I just want to stress one more thing if we're talking about NRC, because we're talking about all these intrinsic variations, so animal-related variations, and those variations can also occur within your herd. So if you think of, for example, about your dairy herd, and you will calculate your trace mineral requirement or the trace mineral requirement of your animals, you will always work with the average animal in your herd. However, if you assume that the variation in trace mineral requirements follows a bell curve or a normal distribution like here, if you take the normal or the average animal, you are feeding enough for all the animals that fall in this category. However, all the animals that require more trace minerals for some reason, you might actually not be feeding enough. So that's also one of the reasons why we sometimes say that you should feed potentially a bit over the NRC requirements. So those are the intrinsic factors that play a role, but also extrinsic factors. So for example, you are talking about dietary factors. David already explained the chemical characteristics of your mineral is very important. because that makes basically if it's available or unavailable for absorption, if it's prone to be bound to antagonists, and obviously also the amount of antagonists present in your diet is very important. You have high antagonists or low antagonists in your diet. And so as a nutritionist, you have to take all these things into account. And I think we also need to admit maybe that sometimes we really don't know. We don't really know sometimes what the animal status is. We might not completely understand what the relation between the animal status and the actual trace mineral requirement is. We might not know exactly what is in the basal diet, what are the trace mineral levels in the basal diet, what are the antagonists present in the basal diet. We might not completely understand what the influence of the environment is. So there are a lot of uncertainties. And obviously there are also some things like practical considerations that we need to take into account, like what is the cost of the supplementation if you want to choose a trace mineral. Obviously cost is a very important consideration, and other factors. So as I said, there are a lot of uncertainties, especially related to all these factors that we just discussed. And I think the key word here is really predictability. Because if you have at least a predictable source of trace mineral, and with a predictable source of trace mineral, I mean a stable trace mineral, you are at least sure that it reaches the gut and it's available on gut level for absorption, you cancel at least a little bit of this uncertainty. I think that's very important. And just to zoom in a little bit more on the specific minerals, and I'm going to talk a little bit about manganese, zinc, and copper. So I won't be talking about other trace minerals like selenium or cobalt or iodine, but just to zoom in a little bit on these. I think there are a couple of things that we should realize for these specific trace minerals, and that's why I picked them out. So manganese is often supplied to supplemented to animals, not always. Mostly they're supplemented. And I think if we're talking about manganese, one of the things that we should realize is that the absorption is very, very low. So we just talked about the absorption coefficient, or in other words, how much of the trace mineral that you feed is normally absorbed in the gut. Well, we understand that that is a moving figure. It's not a fixed number. However, it's generally very low for manganese. Usually it's below 1%. And we also know that the NRC recommendations for trace minerals are generally accepted. However, the one for manganese is on the low side. And there's a very nice study from Weiss and Socha in 2005 that basically on the basis of those studies, the NRC requirements are revised to 30 to 50 milligram of dietary manganese. And why in this case is a stable source so important? Well, if you're talking about such a low absorption, so for example, you're talking about only 0.5% absorption, a very small difference in that absorption coefficient can make a huge difference in your dietary recommendation. Because for example, if we're talking about an absorption coefficient of 0.5%, and let's assume that we need 5 milligram of manganese absorbed, you would need to feed 1,000 milligram per day. However, if it's only 0.5% more and it's 1%, you would only need to feed 500 milligram per day. So it can really make, on dietary level, it can really make huge differences. And what I said, if you choose at least a stable manganese source and you mitigate any antagonism that can occur in the GI tract, and especially in the rumen, you're at least mitigating this risk, and you're ensuring that these absorption coefficients are, although they are very low, they are optimal. And as I said, that can make a huge difference in the dietary requirement. So IntelliBond obviously is such a source. Then zooming in a little bit on zinc. As the study of Iowa State University showed by Davy, and there's, for example, positive effect of zinc on gut health. And there are more studies that actually show that high zinc, and with high zinc I mean zinc above the NRC requirement, might be beneficial. And there's a very nice overview done by Gooselink and Jongbloed of Wageningen University in 2012, not 2021, that basically shows that there are some studies that find, for example, reduced somatic cell counts, etc. And one of the reasons is that zinc is a very important trace mineral for immune response. It plays has a big role in immune response and the different steps of immune responses. And as we just said, it has a positive effect on gut health. And for gut health, one of the things that I want to point out is it might not even need to be absorbed or not need to be absorbed into the bloodstream as NRC is calculating to have a positive effect on the gut, obviously, because it's only necessary on gut level. So these kind of factors are not accounted for in the NRC requirement. So if we then look at the practical recommendations.
Sjane, can you keep track of time a little bit?
Yeah, sorry, I will finish.
No worries. No worries.
I just want to stress that with a stable source, you're again mitigating these mechanisms, and thereby you're really maximizing these beneficial effects of zinc pre and post absorption. And why should we do that? Why should we maximize these beneficial effects rather than just feeding more zinc? Well, there are a lot of reasons, but basically very high dietary levels are not what we want, also from an environmental perspective, for example. So by just feeding NRC levels or slightly above, we can maximize this if we're feeding a stable source. Then moving to the next slide, hopefully. Yeah, so the last one I want to finish off with is copper, and I think copper is a very interesting one. And the reason is that there is a very fine line between copper deficiency and copper toxicity. So this is a nice study done in the UK, and it looks at liver copper, which is a very good indicator of copper state in the animal. And you see that basically all animals that are in this category, so the orange one are beef animals and the blue one are dairy animals, they have low copper levels, while there's actually also a huge proportion of animals here, the blue one are dairy cattle and the orange is beef cattle, that have very high copper, liver copper. And in these animals, this is really in the range of toxic levels. So in the case of zinc and manganese, toxicity is not that much of an issue, but in the case of copper, it definitely is. And as we said, there's a fine line. You see animals that are deficient, which is basically mostly caused by antagonists. You see that there are animals that have very high liver copper or hepatic copper loading, and that's basically caused by very high copper inclusions. So if we look to another study, but also done in the UK, you see that actually a lot of more than 70% or more than 75% of farms are feeding very high copper levels in their diet, in this case, in early lactation diets. And then the question is, why are they doing that? Are they afraid of antagonism? Or are they just not aware of what they're feeding? And I think we should be very much aware of what we're feeding. There are a lot of negative effects of high copper, as Davi already said. For example, negative effects on digestion, etc. Our advice would always be to go for a stable copper source. We're mitigating the risk of antagonisms, as we know that actually in the presence of antagonists, the availability of IntelliBond copper is twice as high as copper sulfate, while we are minimizing the risk of copper toxicity and also reducing negative effects of free copper when you're feeding, for example. So just as a very, very quick summary, take-home message, trace mineral requirements are a moving target and not very easy to establish. And more is certainly not always better. There are a lot of factors that need to be taken into account, and often we don't know all these factors. So predictability of your trace mineral source is really key, and therefore also stability. And a good example of a stable trace mineral source is in IntelliBond, which we know we've got the data, peer-reviewed data, that they have a higher relative bioavailability compared to sulfates. But there are many more, and that will be also a follow-up in the coming webinars. There are many more benefits of replacing inorganic trace minerals by stable trace mineral sources like IntelliBonds. So with that, I would like to finalize my part. I think we're running a little bit over time.
Yeah, well, I saw already that Davi answered behind the scenes all the questions. Looking at the time, we will not go into them as yet. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to send you all the answers and questions after this webinar, so you all have them as well in your email. So thank you, Davi. Thank you, Shana, for your comments. Sorry, audience, for being a little bit over time. If you have questions after this, feel free to send them to Davi, Shana, or to me. You can use the email addresses that are here. They will be sent to you after the webinar when you request for the handouts or the recordings. As said before, feel free to tune into the other availability webinars that are still to come in the coming months. Any questions, direct them to this email address or directly to Davi or Shana. Once again, thank you all for tuning in. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the time. Thank you, Davi and Shana, for presenting. And talk to you all hopefully soon. Stay safe, stay healthy, and hoping to see you all in the next webinar.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chantal. Thank you, everyone.